This video is by Straight Goods News, SGNews.ca.
Well, I was quite surprised going to the sessions yesterday and today that a lot of what's being said you could translate quite easily across Europe. The same kind of austerity policies imposed by government, same kind of messages coming from government attacking public sector unions, and I think the only difference really is the scale, that the scale of attacks in countries like Greece, Spain and Portugal are much more intense than I think in Canada, and in other countries maybe less so. So I mean, I was just quite surprised at this, but it seemed to be very much the same kind of environment and same challenges for unions.
Greece, Portugal, Spain, the countries you mentioned, these are countries with strong labor traditions and strong unions. The attacks are because of the fiscal situation, I presume.
That's right, and the problem is not just that it's a national government attacking public service unions, it's a national government being pushed by and supported by what in Europe's called the Troika, the famous Troika. So that's the European Commission, the International Monetary Fund and the European Central Bank. And it's within the kind of message of austerity, the idea that these countries have to cut back on their public spending, I think is also the idea that in those countries, because they have strong unions, strong public sector unions, then they're legitimate targets.
And what kind of strategies are unions in Europe adopting in the face of all this austerity? Well,
I mean, I think the first thing to say is that they're using traditional tactics, and I think what's remarkable, certainly what you see in Greece, is the fact that the unions are continuing to mobilise for strike action. That you've seen, I think, over 24 general strikes in Greece since the crisis began, and even this week a further strike in support of transport workers who are attacked by the government for going on strike. And so that's workers coming out, power workers, other workers coming out in support of transport workers. So you have traditional methods, but you also have, I think what's clear from Spain, Portugal in particular, is that the unions are saying that this is a citizens' struggle as well because of the impact of austerity on public services. So they're joining the fact that it's not just about public sector workers and their pay and conditions, it's also about the quantity and quality of the public services they provide.
I see. In Greece, I don't know the Spanish and Portuguese political situation, but the Greek political situation is quite well known here. A government has been elected that's committed to the austerity program. What effect can general strikes have when you've got a government like that?
Well, I think the fact that there's been so many suggests that actually you're not going to necessarily immediately change what the government's doing, but I think it's important for people to see that there is a fight back. And I think the fact that also in Greece you've seen the growth of a left-wing political party, I think that people think that if you're it is important to continue to fight back. And I think you see that in other countries as well. And it's not just, although Greece, Portugal, Spain are facing some of the toughest measures, it's still, the kind of austerity attacks are also going on in the UK, Italy. Ireland is also under a tremendous amount of pressure. So it's right across mainly Southern Europe, but also Central Europe. And you see the unions there taking a number of different initiatives to fight back.
You mentioned a troika. This troika has imposed severe conditions upon all the national economies. What kind of tactics are working for European unions in the face of that kind of a tilted board?
Well, it remains to be seen what's going to work in the end. I mean, the problem is you repeatedly come up with the arguments that say austerity isn't working, and what you see is the Troika up until now having a kind of solid opposition to that and saying, well, we need austerity, we need public spending cuts to give confidence to the private sector. That seems to be a bizarre formulation. So up till now you've seen the Troika act as a solid block. I mean, what now I suppose is the chink in their armour is, I think, the fact that the International Monetary Fund is beginning to say quite clearly that maybe austerity not only doesn't work, but actually, as we've been saying for several years now, prevents you from building a strong recovery for the European economy.
What are some of the non-traditional methods that some of the European unions are using in the face of the attacks on public sector workers?
Well, I think it really varies very much across Europe, and I think I suppose one of the things that some unions are conscious of is trying to tap in to those kind of informal movements that have grown up in opposition to what's going on. So I think you do see attempts by unions to work with some of those movements, and I think maybe one good example is in the UK, where what the unions are also trying to do is provide an alternative message. People say, well, we've got massive debts, what are we going to do about it? So the unions say, well, actually, if you look at tax avoidance and evasion, that's costing the European economy €1 trillion a year. So let's do something about that. And I think that connects with a number of different campaigns across Europe. And in the UK, for example, you've had some very kind of spectacular direct action by a group called UK Uncut, which is tapping into it's precisely tapping into that idea that there's a massive amount of tax revenue there that's not being collected, or that the rich and the corporations are avoiding paying. So I think there are movements like that across Europe. I think the challenge for unions is to see to what extent they can look at those kind of alternatives and to what extent they can work with them.
Tell me more about UK Uncut. Who started that?
To be honest, I'm not sure. I think it's just an initiative mainly by camps. Yeah, no, I think it's outside the union movement. It came from outside the union movement. I think it's mainly probably a student-based organisation, and essentially what they do is it's mainly about raising the issue through direct action. So there are a number of big companies in the UK where it's apparent that they pay tiny amounts of tax. So essentially the direct action takes the form of a group of protesters going into high street stores. Like we have a high street store in the UK called Boots, which is a chemist, a pharmacist, big department stores across the UK. They'd go in and they'd essentially leaflet and generally make themselves known to everybody and let people know about the fact that what Boots is doing by being its ultimate company registration is in Switzerland, therefore it's avoiding a massive amount of tax. And it's those kind of direct action initiatives that I think, to be honest, also are a bit of a challenge to trade unions sometimes as well. It's a new way of operating, and it's something that the trade unions have maybe got to look at to see to what extent they can they support it and can tap into it.
Somehow you've got to move public opinion on this question of revenues versus expenses. The austerity people are saying we have to cut expenses, and Labour has to be saying we need more revenue, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the big challenge is that I think what the challenge is that the right have the kind of what seems to be the common sense argument. So they say we've got massive debts, therefore we have to stop spending, we have to reduce the debt. And it's like Margaret Thatcher used to say in the 80s, it's like almost like running your household. What will you do? You have to cut back, which is, in terms of a national and international economy, is complete nonsense, because what you do has a direct impact on the economy. So if you draw money out by not spending, by saving, then you're going to weaken the recovery. So it's about a question of getting the balance right and saying how best we can organise and fund our public services in order to be part of the economic recovery.
Any other lessons you would offer to Canadian trade unionists looking at this massive assault that's coming at them?
Yes, I think it's worth looking at what the unions have managed to do in the UK. I believe at the moment there's this big controversy about political spending by unions in Canada, and I think one of the attempts by the Thatcher government there to open that up to public scrutiny completely backfired, and the votes that unions were forced to have to ask their members whether they should spend on political campaigning went massively in favour of political campaigns, that the members were voting by 80-90% to say their unions should spend their money in this way. So I think there's maybe some specific lessons there. I think otherwise it's worth looking at all the smaller victories across Europe as well. I think what we've found looking at some trends in the UK, Germany, France, is there is a bit of a trend now away from privatisation, for example, towards remunicipalisation, and increasing evidence, I think this is an important thing, increasing evidence that the kind of assumption that the private sector can do things more effectively and efficiently than the public sector, there's increasing evidence to counter that. And so I thought one of the key things that we're trying to do in EPSU at European level is to gather that evidence across Europe and provide more and more information to our members about the fact that actually there is this trend away from privatisation. It's by no means a question of the tide is turning, but if we can get more and more of this information out, we can begin to turn the tide maybe.